the often stale MMORPG market, it's rare to see developers willing to take gameplay risks. MMORPGs themselves are inherently riskier than most kinds of games, and have often quite large budgets, so many developers would prefer to hedge their bets and stick to tried and true gameplay. But every now and then you have a developer willing to take those risks, and willing to differentiate themselves from the pack. Enter Chronicles of Spellborn, developed by Spellborn International, a Dutch indie company, and published by, well, we'll get into that. Chronicles of Spellborn featured one of the first attempts of an action combat system within an MMO. It was also a departure from typical high fantasy games of its time and fit more of what would later be dubbed as European fantasy. It was also unabashedly difficult, or as developers explained, easy to play, hard to master. Spellborn also boasted an incredible soundtrack done by Jesper Kyd of Assassin's Creed fame, among many other titles. But the upstart indie company bit off more than they could chew, and perhaps took too many risks. Chronicles of Spellborn died a very slow death as multiple publishers seemingly competed against each other and slowly gave up on the project. Why did Chronicles of Spellborn, a game with a bold, unique style of gameplay, seem to just sort of fade away in terms of its relevancy? On this episode of Death of a Game, we will take a look at quite possibly one of the most interesting deaths, the death of Chronicles of Spellborn. Follow me as we attempt to piece together the story behind one of the more interesting, yet obscure, MMORPGs of all time. The story of Chronicles of Spellborn is not unlike an RPG plot in itself, with loads of details and multiple branching storylines. But any story has a beginning, and Spellborn's starts in the Netherlands. A domain name was first established for Chronicles of Spellborn back in 2002, and 2 years later a company named Spellborn International was established to produce the upcoming MMO. Eventually, development began under the subsidiary company named Spellborn NV. With a dev team of 50, Spellborn NV was an indie company with little to no prior development experience, but nonetheless dedicated to creating the type of unique experience they had planned.
Let's go!
That vision was embracing what was being dubbed as the European art style. As lead designer Koen Neeson at Spellborn NV would explain, we wanted to break away from the overused vanilla fantasy setting. And that much was apparent in the game's art. It wasn't a typical high fantasy world like what was dominating the market at the time. The way I would best describe it is post-apocalyptic mixed with fantasy. There was a certain level of darkness to the art, not unlike playing the old Fable titles. The art was certainly striking. It certainly turned heads when the first screenshots were published in the summer of 2005. Likely the most inventive and controversial aspect of Chronicles of Spellborn, however, was showcased during their first closed beta in the fall of 2005, the combat system. When interviewed concerning their gameplay, Spellborn devs stated that we were really keen on making the combat more action-oriented and closer to an FPS rather than a traditional MMORPG. And this certainly made sense, as the engine of choice for Chronicles of Spellborn was none other than the Unreal Engine 2.5 at the time, which other competitors, such as Lineage 2 and Vanguard Saga of Heroes, were also using. Chronicles of Spellborn's combat system required you to aim your crosshair at your target in order for your attacks to land. This was a departure from typical tap-target MMORPGs of the time, which allowed for auto-locking of targets. That change in itself, though roughly executed, certainly set Chronicles of Spellborn apart from the other MMORPGs straight out of the gate. For the time, this was quite possibly one of the most skill-intensive combat systems we had seen in the genre. Especially since, to complement its combat, Spellborn NV implemented a system that was much like Guild Wars 1, where your preferred abilities that you chose defined your character more so than your class. It's worth pointing out that although to the public eye Spellborn NV was the main developer behind Chronicles of Spellborn, thanks to the detective work of Spellborn user Zugu, it has been determined that Kayon Game Studios, another indie Dutch company, was actually doing consultant work behind the scenes. This was confirmed on their website as well as in a few articles pre-launch. To what extent Kayon was involved, we won't ever know, but keep this bit of information in mind. You're gonna need it later on. Note, it's also around this time that it was announced that Jesper Kyd of Hitman, Assassin's Creed, and many other iconic game soundtracks would be working on the project. Quite the feather in the cap for an indie MMORPG company looking to compete with the top dogs of the industry. Despite having its closed beta near the end of 2005, there was still no launch date announced. But what did come was more closed betas over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. In the spring of 2007, IGN was able to determine via some hands-on experience that although the game was difficult and certainly had leveling, it wasn't the traditional MMORPG in the sense that weapons and armor didn't have stats and actually were just mainly cosmetic. Instead, sigils or rune-like modifications were the primary source of your character's power. What I found interesting perusing the article, however, was that Spellborn developers promised that content that would normally require a large amount of players, such as raiding, would not be implemented into the game. Instead, they would focus on smaller groups, such as 4 to 8 player groups, even allowing for solo instances, something we wouldn't see much of in the MMO market for several years to come. The most interesting premise the game presented, however, was that was dubbed Ancestor Quests. These sections allowed players to go back in time to witness past events in the game world's history, and possibly even change them to some extent, which would affect other players who participated in the quest later on. Unfortunately, I never saw this feature properly explained, which makes me think it never was really executed in the way that was intended or was just never actually in the game. But it certainly sounded interesting. I often critique MMORPGs for lacking ways to interact with the world and its story. What Chronicles of Spellborn was attempting certainly fought against that problem. It's right around this time, according to our trusty forum detective Zugu, that K-On! Game Studios stopped working with the Spellborn NV team, as they created a subsidiary dubbed Spellborn Works BV, which was supposed to focus solely on developing Chronicles of Spellborn. There's not much information known about this, and Zugu speculates, as I do, that there must have been some change in game design, direction, or possibly money, as a company who works so closely in development on a project doesn't just stop working on it. As more impressions from major news outlets of the time trickled in, it wasn't until the next year, in 2008, that the launch date for Chronicles of Spellborn was finally announced, 3 years after its first closed beta. That launch date would be November 27th, 2008. Well, only in the UK and Germany? So, actually, let's backtrack a bit. Over the course of 2006 and 2007, Spellborn NV was attempting to find the right publisher willing to publish their fledgling MMORPG. On July 27, 2006, Spellborn NV announced that German game publisher Frogster Interactive bought the publishing rights for TCOS, aka the Chronicles of Spellborn, in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and France. Frogster would also be using its Korean subsidiary to handle the publishing rights there, as well as potentially all of Asia. Well, that's oddly specific, right? These days, publishers usually handle entire regions, if not the entire globe. But during these times, it was not totally out of the ordinary for a multiplayer game to have 2 to 3 different publishers for the game, especially in the case of an MMORPG. Things got even more interesting when TCOS announced another publisher, Mindscape, who would handle publishing in the Nordic regions as well as the Netherlands. But as 2008 crept closer and closer, Chronicles of Spellborn still had no US publisher, and they were getting desperate. Enter Acclaim Games, previously known as Acclaim Entertainment, which launched easily over a couple dozen video games before declaring bankruptcy and being bought by the former CEO of Activision, Howard Marks. Acclaim was then renamed to Acclaim Games and focused on free-to-play MMORPGs such as Two Moons and Nine Dragons. Acclaim Games functioned as a company that tried to bring Asian titles to a US audience. Acclaim Games' roster made this publishing announcement particularly strange though. Spellborn NV, or is it BV at this point, wanted to launch TCOS as a subscription-based MMORPG globally, but Acclaim? I'm not convinced they were ever really interested in that. They saw an opportunity on their doorstep, and that's all the Chronicles of Spellborn seemed to be to them, a potential paycheck. So now that we're caught up on the timeline, in late 2008, where the Chronicles of Spellborn is just on the cusp of launching, but having 3 publishers that Spellborn had to appease was proving to be a huge problem. It didn't help that the publishers refused to cooperate, instead treating their regions like controlled territories in a war. When TCOS finally launched on their promised date of November 27th, 2008, they did so only in the UK, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and then a week later, in France. Acclaim, however, in charge of launching the game in America, they would push back the launch, and yet launch a closed beta at the same time. This is where my suspicions from earlier sort of come into play. Acclaim was intent on launching the game, of course, but they wanted to launch it their own way, and that way would be introducing a newbie zone, where sort of like in a permanent free trial, new players were able to reach level 7 before having to purchase the game. 5 months later, Acclaim finally launched the US version of Chronicles of Spellborn, and although the noob zone was surely helpful, what wasn't was Acclaim's confusing business model, which required you to purchase their currency to buy their subscription, instead of just paying for the subscription outright. To make things even more confusing, you needed a membership to buy the subscription, which benefited you with reduced cost on certain sub-packages. But for new players or prospecting players, they were unsure what the price of the game was, and if they were even getting a good deal on it. Even Penny Arcade did a whole comic on the whole fiasco. And that's not even the end of it. During the launch of TCOS, Acclaim also acquired rights to the UK publishing, which was the equivalent of an invasion force attacking the territories of European publishers Frogster and Mindscape. Both these publishers had their own regions within Europe, and here comes Acclaim to snatch up the UK region specifically. This meant that after Acclaim's launch, there were 2 versions of the game, and within each region, they were IP blocking people attempting to play on other regions' servers. So EU players found themselves separated from UK players, for the first time in a good while. Europe as a publishing region usually accounts for the UK as well, but TCOS kind of broke that mold. So Acclaim not only had to push back their US launch, and when they did launch, players were greeted with a convoluted payment system, but they also gobbled up the UK region, forcing the other publishers to plant flags in their territories, like they were playing Civ 6 or something. What a strange occurrence, a clear example of how selfish publishers ultimately are. Sure, don't demonize every publisher in existence. It is a business, they do have to make money. But in the case of TCOS, it was clear that publishers seem more keen on servicing their markets rather than just trying to publish a good game. The thing is, it's not like Chronicles of Spellborn was doing terribly. For a dev team of 50 people and a reported budget of $18 million, it was boldly going against the grain of many MMORPG aspects and wasn't getting completely ripped to shreds by reviewers. For example, IGN gave the game a middling score and stated that its biggest issues seemed to be based around the game's lack of in-game content, or PvP features. Eurogamer, on the other hand, rated it a tad higher, giving the game an 8 out of 10. Not bad for a rookie indie developer with a bold idea. An Unreal Engine MMORPG with an action combat system that means you need to aim? Sign me up. But what Chronicles of Spellborn also brought that was unique was the idea of a rotating combat bar, which was kind of like stance switching to some extent, but it was a bit strange to be used as a standalone system, where essentially every class was using the same rotating hotbar thing, which just seems a bit redundant to some extent. But the idea was that you could combo certain abilities together, but I'm not really sure it ever really worked as intended. So I could take or leave the whole rotating combat bar thing, but there was enough core game there to be saved. Those are salvageable problems in an MMORPG, especially one with such a unique look and feel, but Chronicles of Spellborn never quite got the time to set its feet. Within 2 months of their US launch and their new UK launch, Frogster, who handled most of the European aka non-UK territories, announced that they were developing a free-to-play version of the game. Frogster was no stranger to free-to-play at the time. They were known for one of their other successful MMORPG titles, Runes of Magic. But this was a bombshell in a way for the game. It had already seemed like the game itself was so split amongst its publishers, but now you had a publisher blatantly announcing that they would be working on another version of the game, one that was free to play. A game with 2 competing business plans? That's one that has quite the confused audience. But then it kinda made sense why Frogster did this, as literally the same day, Spellborn BV, the subsidiary of Spellborn Envy, declared bankruptcy, effectively dissolving its IP to the publishers. That meant that we potentially were going to have a lot of differing opinions. As Frogster continued to work on the free-to-play version, Acclaim also threw their hat in the ring with great interest in the free-to-play version as well. During this time, both developers made their version of the Chronicles of Spellborn free-to-play, until eventually Frogster just shut down the European servers and offered transfers to Acclaim's UK servers. This gets confusing, doesn't it? We have 2 different servers running in parallel, some even within the same region, And now the game's going free to play, so they've made their originally sub-based game free to play in the meantime. As 2009 came to an end, the goal for Frogster and Acclaim seemed to be to redevelop the game for the free-to-play audience, leaving the game as it was until then. Frogster in particular was working with their Asian office to transition the game to free-to-play. Rockstar's plans seemed to work at first, as they relaunched the game in open beta under a sub-licensor, Excite. Regardless, they canceled the game in beta, citing a lack of interest from the player base and low income generated by the item shop. Acclaim was pretty quiet up until this point, seeming to not care even about their game in its own regions, as a bug that plagued the game made it impossible to progress past level 10. The silence was finally broken in January 2010, when Acclaim's CEO promised that Spellborn 2.0, which would fix bugs and launch with the new business model, was on the way. This seemed to be Spellborn's best chance at survival, and so only 5 months later, after allowing their game to be essentially run in maintenance mode, Acclaim was bought by Playdom, who were known for a slew of free-to-play multiplayer titles such as Marvel Avengers Alliance. But more than that, Playdom seemed very business-minded, and were often known for acquiring other companies, but I don't think any of us would have guessed that they weren't in the business of just acquiring other companies. They wanted to be acquired themselves, which is exactly what happened. 2 months later, in July of 2010, Playdom was acquired by Disney for nearly $764 million.
Alright now, get out there and make me some goddamn money!
As expected, Acclaim games didn't last much longer, as after being acquired by Disney, Playdom effectively shut down Acclaim games as well. This meant that there was effectively only one more publisher left in the TCOS race, Frogster, and by all accounts at the time, they were still interested in launching the free-to-play version of the game. That is up until the 3rd of August, 2010, when Gameforge acquired a major stake in Frogster. Gameforge was a Russian MMORPG developer, and they were most interested in Frogster's relatively successful free-to-play MMORPG, Runes of Magic. And that purchase really signified the end of the Chronicles of Spellborn, as that same month, all of the remaining servers were finally shut down. Well, that was probably one of the more convoluted development stories I have told thus far, but behind all of that confusion and these publishers chewing over that steak that was Chronicles of Spellborn IP, there are a few very important lessons here. But I first want to try and answer the question of why Spellborn International would get involved with so many publishers, and I think the simplest answer is a combination of lack of experience and desperation. Could you imagine spending years of your life, years to create a company, a game, and then getting so close to the finish line, but being unable to cross it due to a lack of a publisher? Spellborn was put in a position where they kind of had to agree to certain terms they didn't want to agree to necessarily, because they waited until after they essentially had a finished project to figure out the business aspects of it. And that's kind of where the inexperience creeps in. Securing publishers, and most importantly, the right kind of publishers, is not an easy process. It certainly shouldn't be reserved for a game that is a commodity already. Spellborn was split between multiple publishers, all acting like loan sharks wanting to get the best return on their investments, all the while likely not caring too much about the company behind the game, because if the developer dies, well then the publishers get to do everything their own way, which is what happened. Because as soon as Spellborn BV was declared bankrupt, it seemed like a free-for-all amongst the publishers at that point. Acclaim was the first to promise big things, but failed after being bought out. And then Frogster, which later became Gameforge, also dropped the ball, effectively ending any hopes of TCOS surviving. We ultimately can't blame publishers outright for trying to get their best return on their investment, but in the case of Chronicles of Spellborn, I feel like we have to blame them, at least to some extent. Uncovering this story and building its timeline just left me with a sour taste. The publishers seem far more interested in the money than the actual game itself, which unfortunately never really got any further love after being launched. And sure, ultimately publishers are going to be more interested in their return on their investment than necessarily like the game from an artistic standpoint, but if you don't focus on the art first, there is no business. Which brings me to my next point about the death of Chronicles of Spellborn. In many ways, it was mortally wounded before it ever launched. Launching as an unfinished product in the MMORPG market is basically a death sentence, especially subscription-based MMORPGs. It's very hard to convince a player to pay a sub fee once, let alone twice, especially once they realize the game is lacking. In fact, It's one of the most common causes for a death of an MMO. But in the case of the Chronicles of Spellborn, the game launched with such a gaping hole that there was no feasible way that Spellborn's team could plug it in time, while also dealing with bankruptcy issues and competing publishers. They had a multitude of issues before the player even stepped into the game. As such, the game never really got a fair shake or a chance to prove itself. But that's not to say that it would have worked under the right circumstances per se. I think while Chronicles of Spellborn is quite unique in its approach, its uniqueness in many ways was the biggest contributing factor to it failing as a game. As the lead designer of TCOS said, Vincent, I'm sorry my Dutch friends, Lou, later said, Spellborn was simply too ambitious with not enough resources to back those dreams up. It tried to innovate on too many fronts at the same time. And that sums it up pretty aptly. Although we want indie developers especially to be the ones to push markets forward, as they are willing to take far more risks than established AAA companies, taking too many risks is, well, it's a giant risk in itself. The Chronicles of Spellborn didn't just throw conventional wisdom of MMORPGs out the window, it kinda shot them out with a cannon. Instead of tab target combat, they went with a bold action combat system. Instead of a typical progression system, they went with some sigil upgrade system to emphasize outfits over statted gear. Instead of a large in-game content in the form of PvP or PvE, TCOS launched with essentially none of that, focusing first and foremost on small content, like a multitude of quests that could be completed as a solo player. Which is a point that the IGN reviewer of the project also made. From a design perspective, TCOS was a bit of a contradiction in many ways, and perhaps not intentionally. For example, they relished in their skill-based combat system and yet only launched with PvP arenas and little to no other content for PvP players. Not to mention there wasn't any challenging raids or any group PvE content either. They crafted this large world full of wonderful sounds and music and a grand narrative, these ancestor quests where other players could affect the world or even other players, a plethora of quest work, and a focus on difficult content, or so they said, and yet emphasized independence and solo content, which kinda goes against many of those tenets. Maybe they plan to eventually expand on these mechanics, but as it stood at the time, the Chronicles of Spellborn felt more like an RPG than an MMORPG. And finally, we have to talk about the rotating combat bar system. It almost just seemed like they made the game with a typical combat bar, and then retroactively was like, you know what, let's just go all out different, and decided to arbitrarily change the combat system. Now, a rotating attack bar isn't completely unique to the Chronicles of Spellborn. Other games have attempted them, but in those other games, they use them specifically in line with certain class archetypes, like the Black Orc in Warhammer. In the end, TCOS's combat bar just seems unnecessary, especially since every class gets essentially the same rotating bar. In the end, the TCOS combat bar just seems a bit unnecessary, and definitely doesn't age well. I greatly respect the developers behind the Chronicles of Spellborn, and the risks that they took to which some extent helped push the MMO market forward. Something many risk-prone indie developers inadvertently end up doing. But there is such a thing as taking an unnecessary risk, and some of TCOS's design decisions seemed very much like this. Sometimes it's better to go with what is tried and true at the moment, especially when you have already taken such great risks elsewhere in the project. The most important aspect about the Death of a Game series is that we take the time to highlight those developers who were bold, innovative, and tried to push the market forward. Spellborn International certainly did that, but as previously mentioned, they fell into the same trap that many other indie developers fall into regarding MMORPGs, and well, that's trying to make the best game that they can make in the boldest way possible, without listening to conventional wisdom or having their business affairs in order. Now, it's not easy to make an MMORPG, not even for a AAA company with financial backing, but it's especially difficult for a small company with a bold vision and a divisive vision. Without the attempts of said companies though, we as a genre, we wouldn't ever innovate. It's those that are willing to take the risk who help us as a market flourish overall in the long term, even if it means their game has to crash and burn. That's because failure sucks, and it sucks to see our favorite games fail, but it's very necessary for the market. Thanks for watching, guys, and make sure to check out my weekly podcast on Monday streamed on Twitch, or you can see it on just about any other platform, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and etc. Or you can check out any of our new merchandise located on the screen. And above all else, if you want to support me making more content like this, please subscribe and consider visiting my Patreon. Thank you.